Today, we're going to take notes about Earth's fresh water, both above ground and below ground. So make sure you print out the Doodle Note page. The link is in your Google Classroom. If you don't have a printer, you're going to need to write it down in your notebook. At the end, you're going to tape in your notes into your notebook. The image shows blue spheres representing relative amounts of Earth's water in comparison to the size of Earth. Are you surprised that the water spheres look so small? I mean, they're only small in relationship to the size of the Earth. The largest sphere represents all of Earth's water. Its diameter is about 860 miles, which is the distance from Salt Lake City to Topeka, Kansas, and has a volume of about 332,500,000 cubic miles. And it includes all of the water in the oceans, ice caps, lakes, rivers, groundwater, in the atmosphere, all of the water that's in you, in your dog, and your tomato plant. The liquid freshwater is the second biggest dot. It represents all of the world's liquid fresh water. That includes your groundwater, your lakes, swamp waters, and rivers. And then if you look at the very tiny bubble right here over Atlanta, that represents all of the fresh water that's in the lakes and rivers. It's the water that we can access. So if you remember from our properties of water notes, only 3% of all the water on Earth is liquid fresh water. And of that 3%, only 0.3% is in our lakes and rivers. Fresh water on Earth comes from our water cycle, right? So we talked about precipitation and we talked about runoff, and those are our two sources of fresh water here on Earth. Pause the video and copy down the notes. Fresh water on the land surface is a vital part of the water cycle for everyday human life. On the landscape, fresh water is stored in rivers, lakes, reservoirs, and creeks and streams. Most of the water people use every day come from the sources of water on the land surface. So one of the sources of fresh water are river systems. Water generally collects in rivers from precipitation through a drainage basin from the surface runoff and other sources such as groundwater recharge springs and the release of stored water in natural ice and snowpacks. So rivers and streams are considered a major feature within a landscape. However, rivers only cover about 0.1% of the land on Earth. Most of the major cities in the world are situated on the banks of rivers, as they are or were used as their source of water for obtaining food or for transport, as borders or as defensive measures, as a source of hydropower to drive machinery, for bathing, and as a means of disposing waste. The mighty Colorado River flows 1,450 miles from its headwaters in Rocky Mountain National Park to the Gulf of California and Mexico. It drains over 246,000 square miles, quenching the thirst of over 35 million people and fueling a $1.4 trillion economy. The Colorado River is truly the lifeblood of the American Southwest. So a watershed is the area or the land area that supplies water to the river system. The Colorado River watershed is vast. You can see that it takes up basically all of Arizona, half of Utah, half of Colorado, and part of New Mexico. Now, when American settlers moved westward in the 19th century, they went in search of precious gold, furs, and land. But today, as the West booms, there's another limited commodity that states need to carefully ration: water. So John Wesley Powell saw this coming. He was the 19th century geologist and explorer who navigated the Colorado River in 1869 and 1972. And he realized that the limited water in the arid West would eventually lead to conflict. So he actually, in the 1800s, suggested that the boundaries of the Western states be determined by their watersheds, and which are the topographical basins that funnel surface water to a single exit point. So if you look at it, Arizona would be most of where it is, as well as part of New Mexico, and Colorado would be split with Utah. So you can actually see that if you change the shape of the states to only reflect the watershed, the states look very, very different. So pause the video and copy down the notes. Lakes and ponds are formed by remnants of glaciers, blocked rivers, and rivers that fill natural basins. Water travels downhill, so a depression in the ground fills with standing water. A pond is a small body of standing water, and a lake is a large body of standing water. Most lakes are freshwater, but a few are salty. The Great Salt Lake in Utah is an example of a saltwater lake. So even though what would be considered a pond in one area might be considered a lake in another, so despite the lack of official characteristics of what makes a pond and what makes a lake, there are several questions that are used to distinguish a pond from a lake. So if the light reaches the bottom of the deepest part of water, then it's a pond. If the water body only gets smaller waves, so like little bitty, like maybe a foot waves, it's considered a pond. And if the water body temperature is relatively uniform, so if the temperature of the water is uniform, that's also a pond. That is officially the geologic difference. Pause this video and copy down your notes. Wetlands are an area of land that's either covered by water or saturated with water. The waters also are often groundwater, seeping up from an aquifer or a spring. A wetland's water can also come from a nearby lake or river. Seawater can also create wetlands, especially in coastal areas that experience strong tides. A wetland is entirely covered by water at least part of the year. The depth and duration of the seasonal flooding varies. Wetlands are considered transition zones. They're not really completely wet, they're not completely dry, and they have characteristics of both. Wetlands are really important because they collect that groundwater that has, and the soil has broken down the contaminants through the peat. So we're going to be talking about a lot of how wetlands work. Pause the video and copy down the notes. There are three common types of wetlands. The first are marshes, and marshes are wetlands that are permanently flooded or flooded during high water periods at the edges of rivers, streams, lakes, or ponds. Marshes may be dominated by submersed, floating leaved, or emergent vegetation. So these are cattails and pond leaves, water lilies, rushes, grasses. Pause the video and copy down the notes. Then we have swamps. So swamps are forested wetlands. There are many different kinds of swamps, ranging from the forested red maple swamps of the Northeast to the extensive bottomland hardwood forests found along the sluggish rivers of the Southeast. Swamps are characterized by saturated soils during their growing season and standing water during certain times of the year. The highly organic soils of swamps form a thick, black, nutrient-rich environment for the growth of water-tolerant trees such as cypress trees, which are the two trees that you can see on the pictures. Swamps serve vital roles in flood protection and nutrient removal. Due to the nutrient-rich soils present in the swamps, unfortunately, many of these fertile woodlands have been drained and cleared for agriculture and other development. Historically, swamps have been portrayed as frightening no man's land. This perception led to the vast devastation of immense tracts of swampland over the past 200 years, such as the destruction of more than half of the legendary Great Dismal Swamp of southeastern Virginia. Then we have a bog. A bog are one of North America's most distinctive kinds of wetland. They are characterized by spongy peat deposits, acidic waters, and a floor covered by a thick carpet of moss. Bogs receive all or most of their water from precipitation rather than runoff groundwater or streams. As a result, bogs are low in nutrients needed for plant growth, a condition that's enhanced by acid-forming peat mosses. This is where you end up finding the Venus flytraps and the sundew plant. Bogs serve an important ecological function in preventing downstream flooding by absorbing precipitation. So bogs are made of peat. So peat, after drying, peat, so that kind of plant matter, partially decayed plant matter, is used as a fuel, and it's been that way for centuries. More than 20% of home heating in Ireland comes from peat, and it's also used for fuel in Finland, Scotland, Germany, and Russia. Unfortunately, once the peat's been extracted, it can be difficult to restore the wetland, since peat accumulation is a slow process. More than 90% of all bogs in England have been damaged or destroyed. And because peat is anaerobic, meaning that it has no oxygen, they're excellent at preserving things that fall or are thrown in peat bogs. This is the Tolland man, and he was found in a bog in Denmark. He is a naturally mummified corpse of a man who lived during the 4th century BC. He was found in 1950 preserved as a bog body on the Jutland Peninsula in Denmark. The man's physical features were so well preserved that he was initially mistaken as a recent murder victim. Though the cause of death was determined to be hanging, scholars believe the man was a human sacrifice rather than an executed criminal because of the arranged position of the body and the fact that his eyes and mouth were closed. Coastal wetlands are very important features. They include both saltwater and freshwater wetlands, and they're located within the coastal watersheds. Salt marshes are coastal wetlands that are flooded and drained by salt water brought in by the tides. They're marshy because the soil may be composed of deep mud and peat. Peat is made of a decomposing plant matter that is often several feet thick. It is waterlogged, root-filled, and very spongy. Mangroves are mangroves. Mangroves are survivors. With their roots submerged in water, mangrove trees thrive in hot, muddy, salty conditions that would kill most plants. How do they do it? Through a series of impressive adaptations, including a filtration system that keeps out much of the salt and a complex root system that holds the mangrove upright in the shifting sediments where land and water meet. And you can see that here in these roots. They're just really kind of funny. Part of a mangrove forest's value comes from its ability to modify and support the surrounding environment. The complicated root systems absorb the impact of waves, which allow for the buildup of sand, dirt, and silt particles. The roots even hold onto these sediments, which lead to better water quality and a reduction in erosion. Mangroves further improve water quality by absorbing nutrients from runoff that might otherwise cause harmful algal blooms offshore. Both coral reefs and seagrass beds rely on water purifying ability of nearby mangrove forests to keep water clear and healthy. In fact, they found that if you destroy or damage mangrove forests, coral reefs that live nearby are damaged as well. Coastal wetlands include seasonal and relatively permanent coastal plain freshwater swamps and marshes, coastal beaches, rocky shorelines, marshes, mangrove swamps, mud flats, and sandbars. And you can see that there are a lot of ecological services and features that they provide. They provide protection from storm surges. They collect nutrient runoff from the agriculture. There also tend to be nursery areas for different fish and wildlife. The wildlife and wetland ecosystems are really, really vast and varied, and they provide excellent recreation. Glaciers are a huge mass of ice that moves slowly over land. Glaciers form when snow remains in one location long enough to transform into ice. What makes glaciers unique is their ability to flow. Due to sheer mass, glaciers flow like very, very slow rivers. Some glaciers are as small as football fields, while others grow to be dozens or even hundreds of kilometers long. Icebergs are actually parts of a glacier that have broken off into the ocean. Underground water comes from precipitation that soaks into the ground between particles of soil and space in the layers of rocks. This picture shows the Tam Kyon Z cave in Vietnam, which hosts one of the largest active cave rivers worldwide. That looks like an amazing field trip. Groundwater is water that's infiltrated the ground to fill the spaces between sediments and cracks in the rock. Groundwater is fed by precipitation and can resurface to replenish streams, rivers, and lakes. Aquifers are a common misconception about aquifers is that they're underground rivers or lakes. While groundwater can seep into or out of aquifers due to their porous nature, it can't move fast enough to flow like a river. The rate at which groundwater moves through an aquifer varies depending on the rock's permeability. Aquifers naturally filter groundwater by forcing it to pass through small pores and between sediments, which help to remove substances from the water. The natural filtration process, however, may not be enough to remove all the contaminants. Many of the aquifers have been there for millennia. So why are wetlands important? So wetlands are a critical part of our natural environment. They protect our shores from wave action, reduce the impacts of floods, absorb pollutants, and improve water quality. They provide habitat for animals and plants, and many contain a wide diversity of life, supporting plants and animals that are found nowhere else. So, wetlands preserve our water, control erosion, provide shelter to many, many, many animals, provide food for livestock, protect the biodiversity, and provide recreation. Well, where can we find wetlands in Arizona? So, did you know some wetlands are man-made? At a place 15 minutes from downtown Phoenix, a wetland restoration effort has been in the works for more than a decade. When you think of wetlands, you think of Florida Everglades and Louisiana Delta, but the Sonoran Desert? Did you know that the two largest constructed wetlands in the Southwest are located here in the valley? Tres Rios is where the three main rivers of the Phoenix metropolitan region come together. You have the Salt River, the Agua Fria, and the Gila. For more than 15 years, the city of Phoenix has been restoring a Phoenix area near 91st Street and Southern Avenue back to what it once was, wetlands. Tres Rios has become a multifunctional gem-free ecologist. It recycles water, reclaims it, it does water quality, it is habitat restoration and a flood protection element. The area functions much like a recycling factory. There are several patches of wetlands on the 480 acres of land. About 150 million gallons of treated wastewater a day is pumped into the wetlands. They act like a filtration system in stages where one after another screens and stabilizes the water. It ultimately flows into the river bottom where it becomes a wildlife paradise for hundreds of species that live on, under, or around the wetlands. If you wanted to see a bird that was really strange, you can come out and see a bald eagle. They also have bass in the water, and also they have beavers. When you're done with the notes, please tape or glue them into your composition notebook. Upload a picture of your completed notes into Google Classroom.